Over the past few months, trade relations between the United States and Canada have experienced significant tensions due to the imposition of tariffs and subsequent retaliatory measures. Although the trade dispute between the US and Canada initially centered around federal-level confrontations, it has now expanded, with individual Canadian provinces taking their own retaliatory actions. British Columbia has emerged as the most prominent example, implementing targeted economic measures against the US. On February 1st, President Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico, with a lower 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. These measures were justified by the US administration as necessary to address issues related to illegal immigration and drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl crossing the northern border. On February 2nd, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced plans to impose 25% retaliatory tariffs on US goods, targeting products such as orange juice, wine, spirits, beer, coffee, appliances, apparel, footwear, motorcycles, cosmetics, and certain paper products, amounting to $30 billion. On February 3rd, both countries agreed to a one-month delay in implementing the tariffs to allow for negotiations, with Canada committing to appointing a fentanyl czar and enhancing border security measures, while Mexico agreed to deploy additional troops to its northern border. On February 10th, President Trump announced a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from all countries, including Canada and Mexico, citing national security concerns. On March 3rd, President Trump confirmed that the previously delayed tariffs would take effect on March 4th, stating that there was no room left for further negotiations. This announcement led to significant declines in US stock markets, with the S&P 500 index falling by 1.8% and the Nasdaq 100 index by 2.6%. On March 4th, the US implemented the 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, and Canada simultaneously enacted its retaliatory tariffs on US products worth $30 billion. On March 6th, the US announced a 30-day delay on tariffs for goods compliant with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, covering approximately 38% of Canadian imports. In response, Canada paused its planned expansion of tariffs, but maintained those already in effect. On March 12th, the US imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, and in retaliation, Canada announced that starting March 13th, it would implement 25% tariffs on an additional $2.6 billion worth of US goods, including steel, aluminum, and various other products. On March 13th, Canada's additional retaliatory tariffs took effect, further escalating the trade dispute between the two countries. The trade war between the United States and Canada has escalated beyond federal-level confrontations, with individual Canadian provinces now implementing additional measures to counteract US tariffs. Ontario is halting alcohol purchases from American producers. Quebec similarly responded by removing American products from liquor store shelves and launching a comprehensive review of government procurement contracts involving US companies. Other provinces followed suit with targeted responses. Manitoba and Newfoundland and Labrador banned American alcohol sales, reflecting widespread provincial solidarity. Nova Scotia raised highway tolls, doubling fees specifically for American vehicles entering the province. Yukon implemented both an alcohol sales ban and a detailed review of its contracts with American businesses, identifying opportunities for further economic retaliation. British Columbia emerged as particularly prominent, implementing selective bans on alcohol imports from US Republican-led states as part of a broader economic countermeasure. In early March 2025, British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, announced plans for legislation that would give the province power to impose tolls or fees on US commercial vehicles traveling through BC to Alaska. This proposal emerged as part of a broader package of retaliatory measures in response to US trade actions. The Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act, introduced in the BC legislature, would authorize such tolls, though it would not automatically institute them without further government action. The mention of ferries traveling along the coast in the legislation also suggests the province sought flexibility to levy fees on marine traffic. Premier Eby made clear that the toll authority is aimed at commercial trucks using BC highways to reach Alaska, while private passenger vehicles and tourists were not explicitly singled out. This move was a direct countermeasure to threatened US tariffs, allowing the province to apply fees to commercial trucks transiting through British Columbia on their way to Alaska. Eby stated that it was a response to American trade pressures. Although details were initially sparse, the legislative tool was designed as a deterrent or negotiating chip, and while fees may not be used immediately, BC wanted the option available. Even the possibility of such tolls alarmed Alaska due to its reliance on the routes through British Columbia. Tolls on commercial trucks would raise the cost of overland shipping, with Alaskan importers and trucking companies potentially facing significant fee increases, which would likely be passed on to consumers. The executive director of the Alaska Trucking Association warned that such measures would significantly increase transportation costs, disrupt supply chains, and raise prices for essential goods. Higher costs on trucked goods could especially affect the prices of fresh produce and groceries in Alaska's interior and road-connected communities. While alternatives like sea freight exist, they have limitations in speed and capacity. In short, a British Columbia toll would act like an added tariff on goods bound for Alaska, making an already expensive supply chain more costly. If tolls were steep, some freight companies might reroute or reduce service, and limited alternatives would strain the system. A sudden cost imposition could also strain small Alaskan businesses. Alaska's supply chain is finely balanced, and an added fee or administrative hurdle at the British Columbia border could introduce new friction. The majority of freight by sea would be unaffected by volume, but the impact would be acute for time-sensitive and specialized cargo like fresh foods or emergency equipment. If British Columbia's toll measures expanded to other modes, like fees on ferries, tourism could feel an impact. And one scenario raised was retaliation against Alaska-bound cruise ships. British Columbia might consider port fees or restrictions that could complicate cruise itineraries, as nearly all Alaska cruises stop in British Columbia. Any friction in cruise operations could lead to fewer stops in Canadian ports or regulatory changes in the United States, which might reduce the attractiveness of Alaska cruises. With nearly 2 million cruise passengers visiting Alaska in a normal season, even a small drop or routing change could have economic repercussions. Tolls on highways could also indirectly discourage some road tourists if RV caravans face delays at toll stations. British Columbia officials acknowledged that completely. New toll infrastructure would be required, and it might be complex to implement. Portions of the Alaska Highway are covered by international agreements that historically barred tolls, which could legally complicate British Columbia's plans. The proposal did not explicitly target the Alaska Marine Highway ferries, but charging fees for coastal ferries could imply charging Alaska's ferries if they use British Columbia ports or waters. Prince Rupert's Ferry Terminal, for example, might see new provincial fees. And Alaska's already financially strained ferry system might reduce service or increase fares to cover the expense. Further reaction in Alaska to Premier Ebby's toll suggestion was swift and strong, reflecting bipartisan concern over protecting the state's economic lifelines. Alaska's governor urged calm and a focus on federal-level resolution of the tariff dispute, expressing hope that Canada's federal government and the United States administration would resolve their trade issues before any provincial tolls were implemented. He cautioned against unilateral moves by provinces or states that could have negative consequences on broader discussions. Great countries work out solutions to tariff issues, and provincial and state governments refrain from making unilateral decisions that may have negative consequences, Dunleavy said, diplomatically encouraging British Columbia to reconsider its response, suggesting a desire to de-escalate, acknowledging Canada's grievances, but warning that retaliatory tolls would set a harmful precedent. Dunleavy's tone was notably measured, emphasizing friendship between Alaska and British Columbia, even amid national disputes. In contrast, Governor Senator Sullivan took a more combative stance, threatening counteractions if British Columbia were to toll Alaska-bound traffic. In a radio interview, Sullivan said he would push to waive the U.S. law that forces Alaska cruises to stop in Canada, thereby allowing cruise ships to bypass Canadian ports entirely. This law had been temporarily waived once before, in 2021, when Canada closed its ports during COVID-19, allowing foreign-flagged cruise ships to sail directly to Alaska from Washington. Sullivan warned British Columbia, "You know, Canada, you don't want to mess with Alaska. If you do, we're going to work hard on having our cruise ships bypass your ports, and it'll really hurt their tourism." He argued that Alaska could leverage the cruise industry as a bargaining chip, since British Columbia's coastal cities, like Vancouver and Victoria, benefit from Alaska-bound tourism. Essentially, Sullivan signaled that if British Columbia targets Alaska's supply line, Alaska would urge US policymakers to target British Columbia's tourism inflow. This response highlights how intertwined the two economies are and how political leaders might seek to retaliate by upsetting that interdependence in the other direction. The trucking industry in Alaska reacted with alarm at the prospect of tolls. Jamie Benson, executive director of the Alaska Trucking Association, issued a statement emphasizing the harm such fees would cause. He stated that tolls on the British Columbia route would significantly increase transportation costs, disrupt supply chains, and raise prices for essential goods that Alaskans rely on. Benson urged British Columbia policymakers to remember the traditionally great relationships and commonalities shared with Alaska, and to hold off on actions while national governments sort out the tariff issues. This plea underscores that the business community sees this as a dangerous escalation. Other Alaskan business organizations, such as state commerce chambers or specific industry groups, echoed concerns that regional trade flows should not be impeded. Many noted that Alaskans and Canadians on the ground have enjoyed decades of amicable commerce, from freight companies working seamlessly across the border to joint tourism promotions, and that a toll war would be mutually destructive. Members of Alaska's state legislature also weighed in, particularly those with personal stakes in transportation. State Senator Robert Myers, who is a truck driver by profession, offered a dire warning about the toll's impact. Myers stressed that Alaska's supply of fresh produce would be jeopardized since so much of it comes by truck, and he noted potential effects on the oil industry's logistics. His perspective as both a lawmaker and a trucker gave weight to his words. Other lawmakers in Juneau spoke of the importance of maintaining strong ties with Canadian neighbours. There were calls for the Alaska administration to engage directly with British Columbia officials to find a resolution, and for the U.S. Trade Representative to consider Alaska's situation in any federal negotiations. Although the loudest voices were about freight, those in Alaska's tourism sector also paid close attention. The cruise industry itself, mostly large companies based outside Alaska, stayed quiet publicly on Sullivan's suggestion, but local tour operators and Alaska's visitor industry advocates did not want a long-term rift. Some Alaskan tour businesses worried that if the dispute escalated to the point that cruise ships truly bypassed Canadian ports, it could introduce uncertainty or logistical challenges, despite possibly more direct cruises. Ferry system supporters in Alaska, already struggling with reduced service, also voiced hope that the Prince Rupert Link and cross-border travel would not become casualties of a trade fight. In general, Alaskans who regularly travel the highway or ferry noted that friendly cross-border travel is part of life in the North and urged restraint on measures that would punish ordinary travelers. Now let's look at the transportation links between the two countries. The principal land route linking Alaska to the lower 48 is the historic Alaska Highway.